There are a lot of ways to work with clay, and the potter's wheel, of course, is one of those ways. But for a generic term that describes all the other ways of working with clay, we use the term hand building. Now, of course, the number of techniques involved with hand building are almost unlimited. But what I would like to do right now is to show you some of the very basic ways that we have to work with, and you can then, of course, take off on your own personal directions with them. To start out with, I'm going to take and roll out a slab of clay and then design with that and drape it inside a support structure. So our first basic hand building technique will involve the use of an outer support structure. So I'll just start right now. Now this clay is fairly stiff right here, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to put a piece of cloth, which in this case happens to be an old discarded pillowcase, and I'm going to roll my clay out on that into a slab form. Yeah, this clay is fairly stiff. When you have clay that is stiff like this, it might be a little easier to take and sprinkle some sand beneath the clay, and it'll roll out a lot easier. Let's just do that for a minute here. Now what the sand does, it acts like little ball bearings, and the clay will travel on that real easily. Any stuff you have on the rolling pin, of course, leaves an imprint, so you want to keep that fairly clean. Now I have an air pocket right here. You can just take and prick that with a pin tool. Roll out. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now the slab is still fairly thick. And I'm going to want a piece maybe this large in diameter. So before I finish rolling, I'm going to cut that diameter out very quickly. Now you'll notice that the edge here is very harsh and maybe very unattractive. It's not a very sensuous edge. But by rolling it out with the rolling pin now, I will soften that edge and it'll have a very organic quality. So just watch that edge change. It'll be much nicer. Yeah, it looks much better. There we go. Now you can see where this is a lot softer and it's more rounded. But I'm going to take the sheet or the pillowcase off right now. I don't need this any longer. If I want to do some design work, now is the time to do this. And maybe one way to do it is to cut it up. Let's do this. Oh, maybe like so. Now, if I want this for the inside of the bowl form, I'm going to work on the back side. So I'll turn this over, take the strip out, maybe position it something like that. I'll just cut this up into a bunch of strips. I'll start one there. And just keep going right along. Now let's put a big one in the center there. Get one here. Looks good. Now, because this clay is fairly soft, we wouldn't have to score the mating pieces or use any slip or slurry to join them. You simply take the finger and work them together, like so. It's clay is nice and soft, so it'll just attach itself to the adjacent pieces. Now, I don't want to put too much force on here because I want to keep that little strip design pattern going on the other side. So I'll just try and do this very, very carefully. You could take like a metal rib and scrape this smooth. In fact, what I'll do is I'll just do one little section so you'll get an idea as to how you would do this. I'll just scrape this area right here smooth. And if you wanted the back to look real good, go over it with the finishing rib. And you would spend some time doing that and it would look fairly decent. But we won't spend any more time with that. So let's see what we have on the other side. There you can see the shape, and you can, because I didn't press down too heavily, the seams create a nice little pattern here. I'm going to push this one in just a little deeper. Yeah, that looks better. Go with that. Okay, so now we need a support mold. What we have here is a plaster one, and the way you would make a mold like this, and it wouldn't matter what size you'd make, but you just simply take a salad bowl, a mixing bowl. In this case, it was a cooking wok, and the wok was placed upside down on some newspaper, and Vaseline was applied over the wok, and then plaster was mixed up in a fairly stiff consistency and spread around the wok. Well, that plaster will dry up in approximately 15-20 minutes, and you can slip it right off the form and work with it. Works real fast. So what I've got here is a piece now that I can just drape inside this mold. Maybe it's just a little bigger in diameter than I would like, because when you're using a plaster mold, you kind of don't want to have the clay piece go beyond the plaster, because sometimes you'll pick up the edge of the mold. But we can always change that. I could just cut it if I'd like to. But basically, this is the kind of shape that you would have. Now, you can simply walk away and come back tomorrow, and this piece will be dry. It'll pull away from the plaster, and clay shrinks about 10-12%, so it'll just be very easy to slip out of there. You just slide it out of the mold. Let me just, because we're hanging out here, let me just cut that off. And although I should tell you, I do like this organic ending here, but in this case, maybe a cleaner rim is going to be what we need. So I'm just going to cut that even. Pull that out like so. Now, once again, we have that cut, harsh edge, and that's not so exciting. So if you go over it with a sponge inside the mold, I think you're going to be in better shape. Let's just clean that up. Yeah, there we have sort of a clean edge, and looks much nicer. Now, this piece then, of course, is all done. And remember, the size of the molds that you work with determine, the basic contour of your piece. But you could take the same mold and create 20, 30 pieces in it, and each piece would be different because each piece would be designed differently. I'll show you a large one that's here. Let's get a turntable out here. Take a piece like this. This was done in a very large plaster mold. Would be a mold roughly this size right here, and as you can see, you can make some pretty large bowls in that form. What makes this piece so interesting to me, and if you can get a nice view of the edge here, it has a very organic rim, and I think that's what's really exciting. I don't think the piece we just created is half as exciting because I cut that rim very even and uniformly, and it's sort of cold and not as sensuous. But another thing about this large piece, instead of rolling a slab out and creating a design on the table in a flat format, you could take the slabs, cut them out, press them in your mold, and simply create the whole piece inside of the mold without ever rolling them all out. Of course, the inside has to be ribbed. It will take you a long time to do that. And then, of course, finish up with a sponge. 10, 20 minutes worth of work in there will give you a nice, even interior. Another way to work is to, using a plaster mold, is to work on top of a mold, what we call a hump mold. And I have here a plate by one of my students, and this was done over a plaster form. And I'll show you basically how he did that. This is a rather large piece of plaster, and he had it's solid, and he took like a child's saucer that they use in the wintertime for sledding down hills. It's a rounded plastic shape, and he cast plaster inside of that. And what he did, he got this this basic hump shape. And what Ken would do, he would just roll out a large slab, drape it on top of this mold, and that's how he basically works. But in this particular piece, you'll notice that there's sort of a grid pattern going on. So he would take several coils and see if I can roll out a coil real quick here. Just so you get the idea of how that was done. Well, these coils just aren't fat enough, but put two together. Yeah, Ken's used the grid quite a bit here. It's a good ground plane to work off of. I'm going to make this one fatter too. So he'd basically lay a grid of coils on top of the mold, like so. You'll notice he's got little chunks on the interior here. These would be chunks of dried clay that he would crumble up and put in here, and then he would take an entire flat slab of clay and drape that on top and roll them together. Let me just get a little sample here for you to see. He would do that, of course, all the way over the piece. And that would give him a slab design on the other side where the grid would come into play. I guess my coils are a little fatter than Ken's. Now, to finish this up, what he would do, he would center this plaster mold on the potter's wheel and just spin it. And then with a sponge, he'd just like smooth out this void. And of course, take a pin tool and cut himself a nice edge. And the foot that you see right here, of course, was a large coil, about this big in diameter, that he rolled out and attached to the base of this slab. And while it was spinning, simply threw it into a foot shape. The only disadvantage of working on top of a hump mold like this is that when the clay shrinks up, it wants to move. It has to move. And if the curvature or the contour of this mold is too steep, it's going to tear. It's going to crack. But fortunately, this one's very subtle, so the plate can move up a little bit. And then Ken always kind of takes them off before they get too dry anyway. Okay, so what you've seen there is a basic technique for hand building that probably is the most universal of techniques going. There are so many different ways that you can use the inside of a mold to create a piece. Like this piece right here, another student piece was created inside of a plaster shape. But you'll notice they just played around with a different kind of an ending, just some patches of clay kind of put together. A little rope was left in here, and just kind of glazed partially with a turquoise glaze. Looks pretty good. Now, the other basic way that I think is of universal importance is to take and work around a supporting structure. And to do that, you would roll out a slab and then wrap it around something. Now, this something can be, in most cases, tubes of different diameters. You could use large milk cartons, or you could use small 1-inch dowel rods for that matter. But I happen to have a tube here that's about 4 inches in diameter, some kind of mailing tube. And the catch again here is when you're working around a supporting structure, you have to slide the clay piece off the structure before it stiffens up, because as that clay dries, it's going to want to shrink, and it'll tear itself apart if you don't slide the clay off the support structure. And I think the best way to be able to slide that off is to put some kind of release agent between the clay and the form. And what I've got here is a sheet of newspaper, and I'll just tape that into place, and we'll work around that. There we go, we're all set with that. We can still use that clay there too, but might as well start with a new piece. Probably won't need all of this. Let me just take part of that. Another way to make a clay slab, other than using a rolling pin, is simply to throw the slab. And let me flatten this out a little bit and I'll show you what I mean. We have a slab roller here in the studio which gives us uniform slabs. If you wanted a desired thickness, you could achieve that with the rolling pin by simply putting dowel rods on each side of your clay, and the diameter of your dowel rod will determine the thickness of your slab. And you would go over it with the rolling pin until the rolling pin would hit the dowel rods. And that would give you either a 3/8 or a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch thick slab. When you're working this way, just simply slide the clay towards you and throw it like so. And keep flipping it over as you do that. And what that does, it stretches out the clay. Gives you a nice organic edge too. But you can see, like right here, there's a little bit of a tear going on there because the clay is being stretched. Sort of like bark on a tree. You notice that bark sort of has that teariness to it. But sometimes it's nicer to do this than maybe use the rolling pin. Now I'm getting a nice shape here that would drape very nicely into a external support form. Let's see. Let's decide that this is going to be the bottom of my piece, my cylinder. Maybe I need a little more clay here. Let's just stick that in there. Okay. Then I'll do the top, maybe somewhere in here. Now, here's where you want to start designing again with the clay. I'm going to design on this side, and let's see, it's sort of nice to have some kind of ending along the top. So I'm going to cut this little band out and put that there, like so. Let me go over there with a rolling pin, see what we've got. And notice this harsh edge right here. I've got to roll that down so it's a lot smoother. There, it looks a little nicer now. Now if I want to do something in here, now is when I decide what it is I'm going to do. You can use like a rolling pin to make some marks, you know, other marks. You can also use tools to imprint with anything. You could even use like fingers, etc. Or you could take this piece of molding that is one of my favorite tools and imprint with that. You can use it in several ways. Now what I like to do once I make some what I call art marks into the clay surface is to take and go over that with a rolling pin. And what that does, it like creates a marriage between the marks in the clay surface. Now I kind of maybe squished that one out a little too much. Let me come back in and deepen that. Okay, there we go. Just see if I want something else here. Yeah, I'll put that in there. Okay. Oh, this is sort of humpy here. Let me just smooth this out too. Yeah, I'll go with that. I want to just roll this now over the clay or the cardboard form. And you can just sort of cut it off where you think it's going to be too much. Now I don't have to score this. I could, it wouldn't hurt at all. But because the clay is soft, I can just roll right over that. Put a little piece in there. Now, I just need to find a base. So I'll just make a base with this. I'm going to cup that in a little bit. This way, the bottom will be sort of concave so that the pot won't ever run the risk of just rocking on the clay. I can just slide this right off. I could have waited if the clay was soft. Just put that up there. Take your pin tool or your knife, fiddling knife, whatever you want to use. Cut the base slab flush with the wall of the cylinder. Now what you want to do is some heavy-duty stitching here. Just take and very aggressively work the base slab into the wall of the form. After you have that joined fairly well, just take the side of your knife and just start to smooth it out. This knife I'm using, by the way, is called a fettling knife. It has a rather stiff but yet flexible blade. It's really a good all-around hand-building tool. This would take me a while normally, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this one area and just sort of clean that up. If you can just watch me do that one little area, you'll sort of see what's involved there. Okay. You could use the finishing rubber if that were necessary. Always make sure the clay is removed from that, because if you have dry clay on the edge of the rubber, it'll scratch that surface. So just clean it up with that. And finally, go over with a sponge when you're done. And pretty soon that seam is invisible. Now these art marks that we have in the pot,
sometimes look better if you come on the inside and pop them out like I'm doing right now. Just gives the pot a little more excitement. Gives the impression of energy being contained inside this form. It's just bouncing around to get out. We'd clean up that bottom here a little nicer. We can even bring those marks out. And you can see how a shape can just take place that way. Before I plopped that cylinder down, I could have taken and squashed it a little bit, like compressed it, so it would not have been a circular shape. You can work with it like that, and then I would have had sort of an oval bottom, an oval base. This piece right here, this is a finished pot, was done that way. It was made around a tube, but you can see the tube has been sort of squished in like this. And this was done with the drier clay because the art marks here, they started to tear. But of course that leaves you a nicer texture, more exciting texture. Then once again, the rims. You can play off the rim with each piece. And I think this rim is much more exciting than this rim right here. I had mentioned that you could roll out even around very small tubes. Let me do one of those real quickly and show you what I mean. I can take this piece right here and reuse that. Let's put it vertically. Just go with something that size. That should be big enough. I'll use the paper off of here. This is an extremely small example of a cylinder, but I think it's important that you just see how little of a diameter you actually need. I think that'll go around there. Be real close. Let me just make it a little wider just to be sure. Maybe I cut that a little too narrow. Yeah, that should be good. Now, let's see if I'm going to use the other side as the outside or this side. That's kind of nice there. Let's do something here. Let's just put that in there. Put those in there. So this will be the outside of the slab. So I'll flip that over. Just coax that clay up on that dowel rod. Ooh, I should have used the other side. I'm going to lose this nice art mark there. It's a good thing I popped in a few other ones with my finger. I think we only need this much clay. Now I'm going to use the tube, or the stick rather, as a rolling pin to kind of roll these two slabs together. And they're joined right there. Let me just make this bottom a little evener. That's good. I can even use the base again. If this clay is too soft, I would let it stiffen up on the tube before I would then join it to the bottom. And I think this is a little too soft. Yes, it is. You can see already where the clay is starting to sag here. Okay? But I could and should just lay it down over the tube and let it stiffen up. But here you can see a very narrow support structure that I've been working around, as opposed to one that was maybe 4 inches in diameter. That support structure could have been 12 inches in diameter if you wanted to make a large piece. So these two techniques that you've just seen right there are pretty exciting. In fact, I have a piece here that one of my students just got out of the kiln a couple days ago, and this was built around a very large tube, much larger in diameter than this one right here, and of course much taller. And it's a raku piece, and a lot of surface decoration going on in it, so that you can see that he really plays with imprint. This is the same student, by the way. This is another piece of David's, and you can see where he's been very free-form in it up here at the top, just putting slabs on in a very organic way, and just letting them fall into place. And another student that I have, Mary, she's a little tighter with her forms, and kind of will tuck them in a little more. This slab right here has a grid-like texture on it, whereas the inside slabs are very smooth. This also is raku fired. That yellow is a commercial yellow glaze right there. So you can see some examples of how you are unlimited in terms of the kinds of forms you can make with that technique. So you would decide according to your own personal preferences. Do you like working inside support structures, or do you like taller forms that can be built up around a structure? And if you use those two techniques, you have almost a lifetime of clay work at your disposal. The other technique that I think has universal appeal, and it's a technique that is my favorite technique, it's called stiff slab construction. And the way you work with clay in this format is that you roll out your slabs and you allow them to stiffen up, and then you work with them. And if you're ever frustrated with clay being too soft or collapsing on you like this last little cylinder piece did for me, you simply work in this other format. And I've rolled out some slabs here for me, and they've been drying up. One slab I allowed to dry a little longer than the other. This slab is a little on the soft side. You can see I can take and I can shape it a little bit. I mean, it's still fairly strong. It doesn't, or stiff rather. It doesn't take my fingerprints. It'll hold its shape quite nicely. I can coax it into a curved position like so. Now this slab, on the other hand, if I were to try and bend it, it would break because it's a little drier. And I'm going to work with this one. And we call these leather hard slabs. So this technique requires that this clay be fairly stiff. I like to call the term stiff slab construction. Just put this guy down over here. If you have sketches in a notebook for making specific forms that have nice sharp corners, you're all set, because you can take your ruler, you can measure out the size of the slab that you might want to cut to construct a box or whatever form you might have in mind. But let me just go through and join two slabs together, because that's all that you need to know. The shapes that you put together, they have to come from you, and that's going to be your creative challenge, is to decide what kinds of forms do I want to create with this particular technique, because this technique, as I say, has universal value. In fact, we could have done this whole videotape showing you just this technique right here, putting stiff slabs together, and you would have enough information to work in clay for the rest of your life by using just this one technique. That is, if you liked it. All right, so wherever you have two mating surfaces, you just can't stick them together like we did with the softer clay here. So we have to soften up this clay. And the way you do that is the mating surfaces, the surfaces that touch, they have to be scored. And that scoring has to be done rather aggressively. And I'll use the pin tool in this case, but I should use a fork. If I'm doing a lot of hand building, I would use a fork because I would get 3 or 4 marks for every movement instead of just one. Okay, that's one surface. And this will be the other side. Now, what do you use for the adhesive? Well, you go to your scrap clay bucket and get some clay slip or slurry, or else you take this clay right here and you crunch it up and put it into water and slake it down until it's like slip. And I have some slip right here, which is just simply very soft clay. Oops, don't need that much. I'm going to put some on each surface. Then I have a little technique that I like to do, and that involves going back over the slip with score marks and working this soft slurry into the stiff slab. For some reason, this sort of guarantees that this joint will not come apart. Okay, that's done. Let me work this one back in. Okay, now you have to put them together. What I like to do is make sure that I leave a lot of clay slab hang over so that I can take my rib and scrape that seam evenly. So I'll position this like so, and then I'll really push down. You just can't put them together and just do it with a prayer and hope that it'll stay. You have to really be very forceful. Really making sure that those slabs are forged together too. And the slabs won't give. They're fairly stiff, so as you can see, they're taking a lot of force from me right here. Notice all the overhang I have left there. Now, if you can work on the inside, take that extra clay that's there, and with your finger, just make a nice little like caulk-like seam. That's right there. Now, this outer edge that's left there hanging out, I just take the fettling knife and I kind of cut that smooth and even. Just kind of rough it into place. Then I'll go over that with a finishing metal rib, not the rubber, but the metal rib, and I just scrape that even. Just erasing that joint. You can't tell where it is. In fact, you might think of these as little erasers. They just really give you a nice clean edge right there. Now you can still see some scrape marks. That's because there's sand and grog inside this particular clay body. And the way you erase those is you get the rubber rib, and remember, take this clay off there. Get rid of that dry clay because it will scratch. Then go over this with the finishing rubber. I'll do this real quick. And what you do, you erase the scrape marks from the sand. Now, we have a very sharp edge right here. Sometimes you don't want to have that because glaze will have a tendency to pull away from the sharp edge. So take your sponge and just go over that a little bit, and that'll soften up that edge considerably. Simple technique, yes? But you can work with it, like I said, for the rest of your life. If you have some carving to do in the clay, for example, you would carve into the clay right now, design-wise. If you were coming in like so. Because if you had these design marks in before the slabs were joined, you would have erased your design marks as you finish the edge. Now this is all done, but to be on the safe side, I would take and cover that with plastic overnight, let's say. Because if I didn't, it's possible, if I just let it sit out like this, that tomorrow when I'd come back in the studio, I might have a crack there. And that crack would come from the fact that the two adjacent slabs, they're pretty dry, and a lot of the water's evaporated, and there's a lot of shrinkage that's taken place already. But for the adhesive, I've used some real wet clay. Now that wet clay, that slip then has to dry, and it's going to shrink. So it just might cause a crack. But if you wrap it up in plastic, you allow the slabs to equalize and to absorb the clay slip and become one. And this becomes a very strong joint. You could do a lot of stuff with this right now. It's not going to come apart. In fact, the slab might break here before it would break at the joint. I have a couple of things that are just around the studio right now that I could show you in terms of what other students have done using this. This is one of Kim's pieces. She works using that same edge, that same technique, and she's put together this piece, and then of course has put a commercial glaze surface on top of that. So all these slabs were put together using that one technique. And Kim's even working on some larger pieces right now. I have this piece that was done by Melody, and this was her first semester in ceramics. In fact, it's one of her first pieces in ceramics. And after I showed her how to use this technique, she has a little daughter, and she was reading The Three Little Pigs to her daughter and decided to turn the story into a clay piece, which I think is a exciting resource for your clay work. And in fact, I even suggested she could just do a whole series of children's stories in clay. But you can see the technique is the same that's used here, but of course her imagination is made for a very exciting piece. But all of these like bricks that you see here, these were cut into the slab after the slab joint was completed. Same with the straw on the roof, and of course the pigs were just like sculpted and stuck on too. But everything was joined after the clay was leather hard. The clay was not put together in this soft state. So you can see the application involved by working with stiff slabs. In fact, the only limitation is that of your imagination. And I think that's a good place to see where the difference between craft and art is in clay. You know, craft is simply the workmanship that goes into making your clay statement. But the art itself is the statement. It's the idea, it's the concept. That's what makes the art. However, if your craftsmanship is weak, what it's going to do is discount your idea. And your idea is just not going to have the strength that it should have. On the other hand, you can have great craftsmanship skills, but if you don't have good resource for your ideas, you're going to make pieces that are well crafted, but they're not going to be as exciting psychologically or visually as they might otherwise be. There is one technique that I haven't talked about, and maybe you've been wondering about it, and that's called coiling. And I'm not going to show you how to coil simply because it's a very easy technique. You can just take and make coils of clay on the table or between your hands, or you can extrude coils from a clay extruder if you have one, and you simply stack coils up. But you have unlimited access to form with coils. And what you do when you coil is you have to make sure you join these coils together very securely. And you can only work up so far when you coil a pot or a form, and then you have to let those coils stiffen up before you work any higher. And if you stack your coils on top of each other, the wall goes straight up. If you want the form to go out, you start leaning each successive coil outward. Or the same thing is true if you want to bring a form inward. You start leaning each stack of coils towards the center of the form. And I'm going to show you a piece here that Dave Roberts did. This is a coiled shape. It's a raku bowl. This was all done with coils. And of course, he's joined these coils together with ribs in a way that you can't see the coiled seams. And this, of course, was raku fired. But coiling probably is a technique that a lot of sophisticated clay workers use to create some very unusual shapes or organic or figurative shapes. But I don't think we need to go through and demonstrate a coiled pot. It's pretty basic, and I think you'll figure that one out real quick. Also, I should tell you, instead of using coils, use slabs, like strips of clay. You can coil like with strips of clay. They don't have to be round little tubes of clay. I think maybe the last thing I want to do on this particular tape is to show you some other ways of working very quickly, and these become like personal ways. Once you start to become comfortable and a companion with clay, or clay becomes a companion with you, you start to think about clay at all times of the night and day. You'll even dream about it. And you'll start to find ways that are your ways of working with clay. And when this happens, this is what I call your personal aesthetic identity that you're starting to develop or you're starting to mature into. And as that happens, you're going to have to problem solve ways of working with clay to create the shapes or the designs that you have in mind. And some of the things I've been working on lately have been quite large, and then just recently, the last few weeks, I've started to make some very small pieces. And I'll show you basically how I'm going after some large pieces, and then I'll real quickly show you how I cut up some clay for a small piece. I started out by making just rolling out tubes of clay and cutting into them to get some designs, and then just taking clay like this, soft clay, throwing it around, coming up with shapes that I could then stick onto this particular base. And I found that I was working with some very small forms, and they were a little too hard to stick on top of each other because there was no surface contact. So what I've done, I've got these pinned together with stainless steel rods, and the rods are very short, so there is no slip that we used on the stiff slab construction involved there. It's slipped right here, but these are stainless steel pins that hold those two pieces into place. So I thought, wow, if I can do that, I can build pieces, in sections like that as tall as I want. And that's what I've started to do. This piece that you see here is an extension of the one I just was showing you, and these pieces are done in sections and added with steel rods. In fact, you could see where it's fairly flexible up here. This piece has a lot of movement. Now I could come back and put some adhesive. I like to use PC7. It's a two-part mixture, and I could join these that way. But I'm playing off the organic part of the clay with some very sharp cut edges here. And I got very excited by that technique right there. So what I started to do is simply create some pieces that involved that technique only. So I'm playing organic torn shapes off of some very clean-cut planes. Now these are all stacked together. The base that you see here here's a base for another piece. They're hollow, and the way I would create that, I would roll out a large coil of clay, take a rod. In fact, I took this very same rod that I used to create a piece from. In fact, I even sharpened it into a point. I would stick this rod all the way through the clay and then roll it out on the table. And that would expand the opening inside this particular clay piece so that it's hollow. Then this is a solid clay form up here that I stuck into place. I'm getting ready to add some appenditures onto here. Then I'll simply build up into a larger piece, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall that way. The pieces that I'm doing now are simply smaller versions where I use a torn edge or off of a nice cleanly cut edge. And I build these now in 2 parts. And of course they're held together with steel rods too. So I do them in 2 sections and join them. It's much easier to work that way. These pieces are real new, and let me show you how I go about doing that. The first thing I do is make bases. Keep them wrapped up so they don't dry out too much. Take a lump of clay, I simply cut into the clay, tear the clay back, and I form these bases. Okay, and then I hollow them out just a little bit. It's not much taken away. So they're still pretty light. And then I'll build the top portions from just large humps of clay. I'll take something like this, and then with the knife, I'll start to cut in sort of an architectural form, dealing with a little bit of architectural imagery on top of an organic form. Now I would just take, I'll just start, I might cut a roof line in here. Let's start with that. Cut that. Won't cut all the way through, but I'll tear it. And you'll see a very smooth edge played off a torn edge. I'm going to cut one on the other side. Cut it just a little deeper and tear that. Just smooth this plane up just a little bit. And the piece starts to take shape that way. Now if I'm going to do something on this edge, I'll simply take and cut part way through, maybe 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. Just go all the way through. Clay is sort of stiff, so it'll tear rather nicely. I'll get a nice organic edge there. Clean this one up. Clean this one up. Go over with a sponge. And you can start to see how that edge is going to shape up. And then what I do is I'll decide where the bottom is going to be, like so. Might want to make it shorter or cut it so it's more even. And then with 2 steel rods, roughly 1 inch long, I'll stick them in here and stick them in here and push that clay right into place, and the piece will be done. Now I'm not going to go and finish it and put an edge on it or a doorway or something like that, like you see on this piece, simply because it will take me maybe too long to do that. But now you're seeing how I've just evolved from working with large pieces to small pieces. And that's why I say when you become a companion with clay, it'll become a lifelong companion, and the pieces that you do with clay will simply evolve as you go along. And that's why I can show you some very basic techniques, and like I say, they are very, very basic. They're almost Mickey Mouse. It's almost an embarrassment to talk about them. But after you understand them and use them, stick them under your belt. They just become part of you. And you just simply find creative ways to utilize them to make your clay statement. And with that, you'll have enough to work with clay, like I say, the rest of your life.